In today's video, we'll be going over this script that allows us to create this design. There are a few steps here that are really useful for many designs. And so if you're interested in this, we'll be going over all the steps. All right, so in this video, we're going to create a dynamic arch structure. So let's start here first by starting with a new project, also a new Grasshopper file, and we'll bring in a point. So I'll go to construct point. And with construct point, we are going to use this to create our segment. Now let's go ahead and move this point in a vector that is in 45 degrees or an angle that we can change. So for that, we'll bring in a vector X, Y, Z, and we'll plug in the points into the geometry and the vector into the motion. Now let's plug in some values for the X and Y. I'll bring in a 5 and make a little copy of this one here, and we'll plug in the X and the Y. This will give us basically a 45-degree angle. Now if we use the same one for the X and Y, it'll make a 45-degree because when you move both 10 in the X and 10 in the Y, this will create a 45-degree line. Now if we change this to having a different X and Y, we have the ability to change the angle here. Now the reason why we're creating these 2 points is because now we'll put them together with a line, and that will become the segment that we'll use for our design. So we'll create a line component and bring in a start and end point. Now there are different polylines and things that you could use. I just like using this one because we could plug in a start and end point. Now that we have this and still have the ability to change this around, let's create a copy of these going in the X direction. I'll go double click here, go to move. In this move component, we'll bring in another value with the slider. I'll just say 15, and we'll plug this line into the geometry, and the motion, we're going to bring in the X value, unit X. So 15 into the factor and the unit vector into the motion. This gives us the ability to move it in one direction, but only create one copy because we only have one number going in. Now if we want more than one number, we'll create a series of numbers that step by a specific number. So I'll double click here and go to a series component. Now we can go here and plug in the 14 into the step and the count for how many. Now start is also important, but for now we'll leave it at 0. And for count, let's bring in a value. So to create a custom slider, we can do 0 and then or 1 less than 25. And so we can create a slider from 1 to 25, and this will give us the number of copies that we can create. Now the series will plug into the factor, and now notice that since it's not just 14, we have a series of numbers starting at 0, then 14, then 28, 42, 56. So it's stepping by 14, and it's giving us 10 values starting at 0. Now we could always start at 14. This means that it will start here. Now, it's not necessary to do that. Starting at 0 is fine. We just have to make sure to disable the preview of this one because that one is redundant on this script. So let's move this over and clean it up. I'm right clicking on the slider, and then you can change the name of the slider. And then here we can do increments. And if some of these values are too small, we can always change the maximum number to something like 30. Now we have the ability to further play around with some of these, as well as this step. Now the reason why we're doing this is because when we create a copy of these, then we can explode that curve and create a segment with those points. So let's disable the preview on this beginning part. And now we'll take these and bring in an explode component. This is an explode curve. This does not work with B-reps or surfaces or anything like that. It only works with lines. So when we plug in the geometry, which are all of these lines, you get all of these vertices. Now, these vertices, if vertices are basically points, so if we go here to a point, we'll be able to plug in the vertices into this point component. Notice that the way that the information comes in is grafted. That means it's in groups. We want to fix that by flattening the input here. And we can now disable the preview on this portion. Cool. So now that we have these points, let's bring them together using an interpolated curve. With an interpolated curve, or this, it says interpolate, it will create a curve going through all of those points. And this is going to be the base of our geometry, right? So with this, now there are different things we can do for creating the base geometry. Let's take this and bring in the midpoint of this curve. Let's also bring in a mirror plane and a XZ plane. So let's plug in the point into the origin, and our XZ plane will go here into this plane, and the geometry will be this curve. So it kind of creates this woven type of design that is dependent on all of these. The other thing we can do is take this plane and move it in the Y direction. And this will give us another level. Will give us another level of kind of change that we can do to it. So we'll move this plane in the Y direction. Now we'll go to a number here. So let's go 15. And let's make our low number, the minimum, minus 100. This way we could kind of move it back and forth. The reason why I want to do that is because now I want to replace this plane that I'm moving. Let's disable the preview on this with this plane. So now we can move this around like this and like this to kind of further change the design a little bit. And now at the end here, we can bring in those two curves together. So I'll go to a curve component and plug in both this geometry, and holding down shift, I'll add this one. Now I'll disable the preview on all of this. So far, so good. So now we still have our YZ plane that was before we moved it. Now, to create the arc, we need to get three things. Number one, a point here in the middle. Number two, another point here and another point on the side. And then we can move this point up to create the arc. So we'll take this plane component and we'll take actually this midpoint component and we'll move it in the x positive and x negative. So let's move this point, this midpoint, in the x direction. Then I'll bring in a slider of like 150 or something like this. Now once we have one value here, we do want to make a copy of this and bring in a negative component. So I slide it down and hold down Alt to make a copy. And now that we have a negative value here, or a negative component, we can plug in the unit vector into the negative component here, and this will make this go the other way, backwards. Now we can take this midpoint and move it up. So we'll move this midpoint in the Z direction. And now we can plug in a value for that. So I'll do 150 slider. With these 3 points, this one, and these 2 down here, we can create an arc. I'll double click here, go to arc 3 points, and plug in first value, point A. Second value is going to be this geometry, which is the point that we moved up, and this geometry that we have here. Now we're going to move this in the Y direction. So let's move this arc in the unit Y. And then bring in a value for the width. Now that's a little bit much, maybe 80 should be okay. And in the same way that we moved it positive Y, we want to move it negative. So we'll make a copy of this and do the same thing that we did with the other one. So we'll bring in a negative value and now plug in the Y into the negative and this one into the motion. So now it's a negative value. Minus 80, and this one's going up, going in the Y direction, 80. Now we can loft together both of these. Holding down Shift, I can add another one. And I could even do other things like make this more of like an arced surface, because what we're going to do now is project curve onto VRAP. The direction is going to be unit Z, so up in the Z direction. What's the BREP to project onto? It's going to be this lofted surface, and the curve that we're going to project is going to be this that is down here. So by decreasing the location of the point moved in the X direction, we can change the location of the start of the arc. And with our unit Z here, we can change how tall it's going to be. Now the amplitude of it, we can always bring this to 0 and change the, let's see here, the value here. we'll have to change this y value and increase it. This. Now, maybe we have too many copies, so we'll go count, lower the count. Maybe the step in between is what we'll play with. And now we can increase the size of it again. So it's one of those things where we can play around with that and get it correct. And ultimately, if we did want to, so let's move this. Let's increase this to 200. And now let's move the plane around, because that's actually what's going to create more of a dynamic design. And let's hide everything except for the end portion of it. So now with this, we can play around with some of this stuff. Let's do 150 max. Cool. So now with this, let's play around with the structure of how we're going to give it a thickness. So let's increase. I do want to increase here as the last thing to change on this is the height, because I do want kind of the start and end to have a full termination here. Now let's bring in variable pipe. So we'll bring in a variable pipe component, and we'll plug in the curve, and we'll flatten those curves. Now for the parameters, we need to create a range of numbers, stepping by 10, by default 0 to 1, and the range is going to give us all those numbers. Now we'll also bring in a graph mapper. And so the range of values, we can always change the number of steps. The range of values is going to go into the parameters, and the range of values will also go here into the graph mapper. The other thing that's important is to reparameterize the curves. This way it turns them into 0 to 1, so we can then play around with the thickness of our pipe. Now, what we need to do is right click on the graph mapper, go to graph types, and we can bring in a sine graph. This will give us the ability to have the thickness in here goes from a small number to a large number. We see that happening here. Now it's a little bit hard to see because of the scale. To multiply the number and get that larger, we'll bring in a multiplication component and multiply the outside values of that by another number. I'll say 5.5. And these values will replace the radii, giving us the ability to multiply and increase the thickness. So let's change this to something like 50. With this, we also have the ability to change the caps to round and play around with this. Since we have 10 steps in between, this is how 10 is going to be. It's going to start at 0, go up to the big number, which is 17.3 times 1, and that's the value here. And now we can take this small number and bring it up do something like this. Now let's take this. We'll create a move in the Y direction. And we'll bring in another value. The maximum will be 200 here, so it can just move it enough to maybe get 2 in. And if we get 2 in here, then we can also bring in a series component and create more than one stepping by 200. So we'll bring in 10. And change here the count back down to 5, something like that. And I'll disable the preview on everything back here. We can always play around with all of these parameters. Now with this, let's bake it and let's take a look what it looks like. So with this, we'll go here to our layers, layer 1 or the default layer, and I'll middle click and bake this. Now I'll disable the preview on it. And actually let me save it real quick and then we'll jump in and take a look at the baked version of it. All right, let's go here to shaded mode. And also, actually go here to V-Ray Interactive. Now, if you don't have V-Ray, you can just go to Ray Traced. But this will give you a better way to visualize your design in a more realistic way. I'm trying to find a okay location to take a good render and to show and display the design. And now let's bring in a material. So either by going to your V-Ray or in here under your layers, you can go to click here under materials on this circle. That will allow you to pick a material to create. Now you can click here, go to metal and change it to a metallic material. This is by default and it already looks really good. Now going here to ray trace, it's going to do the same thing. It's just going to calculate the rays, the reflections and all those things and give you a more accurate representation of what it would look like in reality. But all we need to do is go to V-Ray Interactive, take a look at what this looks like. And what I'll do is I'll capture all of the views. So I'll do zoom, all extents. And this way, I go here to rendered view, and then go to rendered view for all of these. And I can capture every single one of these views so we can see what the design looks like at the end from all elevations and top view, and also in a perspective view. So if you have any questions, make sure to let me know. I will have this in the YouTube section of my website, so check that out. If you haven't already, I also have a script section there, so if you want to check that out, they are optimized scripts that are ready to go. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time.